If you're expecting another "this patch changes everything" video, look elsewhere. There's dozens out there already. I spent close to 20 hours actually playing and testing this patch before making the video and would like to submit my opinion on the topic. Let's jump right in. As with most patches, there's a huge list of crash fixes. However, take this with a grain of salt, as they do this every time and many crash issues still persist.
Yeah, well, this time it's different.
In fact, this was the worst patch I played on in terms of crashing, and at one point I crashed 6 times in a single hour. Previous patches, I would have 1 to 2 crashes over the course of several hundreds of hours. Moving on, let's look at some positives. They added more maps to the dynamic battle map system, 6 in total. To the north, near Revel and Sturgian lands, we have a valley with sparse forest and small roads running through it. Next map in the south outside of Kuyaz. This arid grassland is flanked by a mountain and the ocean with plenty of obstructive terrain to use. I mislabeled one of the next maps, but one is around Odok to the east and the other 3 are around Razich in the southeast. This map has a huge hill with slopes on 2 sides and sparse trees, a great spot for defense. There isn't much to this map, it's mostly wide open and should be fantastic for cavalry heavy armies. And this one has a mild slope with small pockets of dense trees, making it a decent spot for defense against enemy cavalry. And finally, another mostly open map with a few spots of trees. The hill has some potential for defense though, and this tree model caught my eye. I don't recall it being on the other maps. They also added a few more bandit hideouts. It says 4 new ones, but I was only able to find 2 of them after checking every single hideout on the map in 3 different campaigns. The Forest Bandit hideout has a long, twisting road with tons of cover and mostly linear combat, making it easier to attack than the other Forest Bandit hideout. The new Desert Bandit hideout looks great as well, adopting the same linear path as opposed to the other maze-like hideout. This new temple building carved into the side of the mountain was a really nice touch as well. Some armor pieces now change color based on your banner, making it easier to tell who's who in combat. I noticed there were a ton of missing texture files now that were not present for over a year, so I'm not sure what they broke, but certain color combinations are definitely broken. I want to preface this next section by saying this is not a knock on Tailworlds or a complaint, but they are starting to copy some of the more popular mod ideas and bringing them into the base game. Weather events have been added to both campaign map and battle maps alike. It decreases the campaign map movement speed for any mounted units during the rain, and even for some time afterwards when mud would persist. It also decreases movement speed in battle and decreases projectile speeds. However, I wasn't able to verify this as finding a battle with actual rain was challenging. They added a new UI element that condenses income and expenses, making it easier to understand when you start stacking up different sources of revenue. If you hold Alt, it will expand to show more detail and even color codes some items. There's a new pop-up for marriage proposals that show all the important information like character traits, age, attribute points, and more. Keep in mind this only works for proposals for your family members and not your own character. Sadly, we don't get this much information in the encyclopedia and have to roll the dice when considering our own spouse for marriage. One fix that stood out to me was a bug that would cause all formations to turn into ranged troops during a siege. After a dozen or more siege tests, it seems to actually be fixed. Let's go over one of the bigger changes made in this patch: formation targeting. I've got several more tests on this topic near the end of the video, but let's go over some of the basics here. Now we can have our formations target specific enemy formations by selecting our units, moving our mouse over the enemy formations we want them to attack, and issuing the charge or advance command. Overall, this new mechanic works as described, but like anything with Tailworlds, there are still some issues. For example, this cavalry group is targeting the enemy cavalry on our right, but because the formation is a little too wide, a large chunk of our cavalry nonchalantly walk into the enemy infantry shield wall. This is one example, but in literally every test that I ran, something like this or similar happened. The AI tries its best to find the logical path to the enemy, but if another enemy formation is in the way, they will simply walk through it and get slaughtered. The whole point of this command is to reduce the amount of micromanagement needed, but honestly, I felt like it was more work to use than if I just moved the units myself near the enemy and gave the general charge command. At least when I do that, I know exactly what to expect. While giving a targeted charge command, I have to watch them closely to make sure they don't accidentally lock on to a different enemy formation. I've covered how broken auto-resolve in tactics was in previous videos, but I'm happy to say those issues appear to be resolved for now. Before, unit quality had little to no effect on the outcome, instead relying mostly on numbers. Now, unit quality makes a big difference, and they even added modifiers for different unit types and different terrains. Here's a spreadsheet showing the different modifiers. Infantry are the most reliable on all terrains, while cavalry and horse archers excel at flat terrain, and archers get a huge bonus during siege defense. I tested all unit types in both flat terrain and forests at level 1, 150, and 300 tactics, so we can verify the changes are actually working. I fought the exact same party for each battle, so results can be compared accurately. We see an increase across the board when tactics levels increase, although there were a few oddities. When it comes to terrain, infantry performed better in forest than in flat terrain, sustaining 24% less casualties at level 1 tactics, 5% at level 150, and 17% less at level 300. I don't really see a pattern here. It's hard to predict if it's working properly, but at least the trend is in the right direction. Archers had some odd data at level 1 tactics in flat terrain, actually sustaining less casualties than level 150 tactics in flat terrain. However, we do see both performing better overall when fighting in the forests compared to open terrain. We see some Tailworld's math going on with cavalry in open terrain, with all 3 tests being nearly identical, meaning tactics level 1 performed nearly the same as tactics level 300 in flat terrain. Once we move into the forests, there's a big difference in performance with higher tactics, leading to much less casualties sustained. And finally, horse archers. These units seem to perform as expected, seeing better results with higher tactics in both scenarios and worse results in forests. One thing to note, the higher up we go in the tactics skill, the less effect the terrain had on the outcome. So at lower levels of tactics, it's incredibly important to fight in good terrain, but at higher levels, it can mostly be ignored. Overall, I think this was one of the better changes in the patch, although they still have a few things to iron out, it seems. The next fix is pretty important. Rocks, onagers, and trebuchet can now kill instead of only injuring. It was incredibly frustrating to devastate the enemy army with onagers only to have them retreat and fight you again 2 days later with the same number of troops. They also added the ability to push ladders off the walls, even with enemy troops on them. However, in over an hour worth of testing, I wasn't able to push the enemy off a single ladder as they got to the top and canceled the push every time. I even upgraded the town's walls, giving it a bit more time to climb, but still got the same results in the end. I'm not sure if a higher polearm skill would increase the speed of this, but at low levels, it's basically useless to try. Don't get me wrong, this is a very cool idea, but in reality from the testing that I did, it's more of a gimmick than a useful mechanic. In a recent patch, they added Fog of War, making all nobles information hidden from the start of the game. To counter this, they now added the option to get information from the Tavern Keeper. For 500 dinars, you can get all noble information from the owner's clan. They also added the option to turn on birth and aging for consuls, so now everyone can go 50-year-old starts and get tons of extra points. There were a ton of perks fixed, which I didn't have time to test yet, but I do plan on continuing that series in the near future with some help from another content creator. They also changed the amount of Roguery XP gained from selling prisoners based on the unit's tier, with higher tier units giving more XP. Tier 1 gave 2 base XP, Tier 2 gave 4, all the way up to Tier 5 giving 10 XP. All companions in the game had their skills and main level adjusted downward, making them less useful up front, but much better in the long run, as we can put more points where we want them. There were even several companions under level 11, meaning we can get an extra attribute point to place. Some companions with a combat-heavy focus also had their melee skills reduced in certain categories, as opposed to being high level in all 3. I even came across a level 9 companion, which would never have happened before. Overall, these companion changes are great and will open up a lot more options. The biggest downside is leveling combat skills for companions is next to impossible, and it was nice to hire a combat specialist with tons of captain perks already selected. Now all we need to do is to get Tailworlds to turn up companion XP gain for combat skills and we'll be in great shape. Getting pregnant used to mean sitting in a town or castle for days or weeks on end. Now the only requirement is being in the same party, meaning women can get pregnant while on the move. I was able to get it working for both my brother's wife and my own. Typically, it was easy to get 2 to 3 kids out of a campaign, but any more than that would require months of sitting in towns doing absolutely nothing. Now we can expect to have 5 to 8 kids throughout the course of a campaign. When a kingdom loses 100% of their fiefs, they used to raid anything and everything, then ask for 100,000 dinars for a piece.
You disgust me. How can you live with yourself?
A truly idiotic game mechanic. Now, if a kingdom loses all of their fiefs, their kingdom is instantly destroyed, and the clans become independent. Other kingdoms have a chance to recruit them into their lineup, but if they don't find a suitable home after 21 days, the clan is eliminated and all nobles within it will die instantly. While I think this mechanic still needs some tweaking, it's infinitely better than the garbage they had before, so this change is much appreciated. 4 kingdom policies were supposedly fixed. Let's test it to make sure. Feudal inheritance is supposed to make revoking a fief from a clan cost double the influence, from 100 to 200. It's also supposed to give 0.1 influence per fief, a fief being defined as a town, castle, or a village. After passing the policy, we see 1.6 influence coming from a couple towns, castles, and several villages, 16 to be exact, so this part is working correctly. However, we see another case of Tellworld's math. Instead of 200, it costs 300, which would be triple, not double. Also, I'm not sure what the point of this perk is, since the AI will never vote to take a fief away from their vassals. Moving on, Precarial land tenure is supposed to decrease the cost of taking fiefs from a vassal by 50%, going from 100 down to 50 influence. Funnily enough, it reduces by 100% down to 0 influence. Now it's possible to drain all of your vassals' influence by voting to take away their land for free and draining their influence when they spend influence to vote, meaning they can't vote for stupid wars. At this point, are we even shocked to see Tellworld's math? Next, land tax, which takes 5% of villages' income and gives it to the king and reduces the owner's income by the same amount. We see a line item at the very top for 20 dinars, so the money is being taken from vassals' villages. I'm happy to say you don't lose 5% from your own villages in the process. And finally, war taxes. This one is supposed to take 5% from all settlements and give it to the king, reduce prosperity by 1 in towns, and doubles the cost of declaring war for the ruler from 100 to 200. Again, we see a line item for 118 for war taxes as the king and our town's prosperity being reduced by 1. Unfortunately, it also reduces castle prosperity as well, even though the wording says towns. And of course, it increases the cost to declare war by 3 times instead of 2.
Nice.
Workshops also got some attention, adding a warehouse to each town. We're able to supply our workshop with raw materials manually and stockpile their outputs. One unintended consequence of this new mechanic is to be able to store anything we want inside it. For example, if you don't own a fief but want to store crafting materials, you can do that. You can also store armor, mounts, weapons, etc. The space is limited to 6,000 weight, not 6,000 items, so it's fairly limited, but it's better than nothing. Also, it's 6,000 storage per town, not per workshop. So if you own 3 workshops in one town, they all have to share the same warehouse. For smithing, crafted weapon modifiers were added, which changed quite a few mechanics. No longer will we be plagued with a legendary weapon where all the bonus points went into handling instead of swing speed or damage. Now all the bonuses are predetermined and the only RNG factor is what modifier will be used. For example, every single balanced sword with these weapon parts will have the exact same stats. If your crafting skill isn't high enough, the debuffs are extremely bad, oftentimes dropping all stats by 10 to 20 points in all categories. I also ran into yet another bug. This guy has 2 smithing skill and is still able to make masterworks and legendary weapons along with broken and dull blades at the same time. I'm not 100% sure what's causing it, but it seems if one person in your party has high tier perks, then anyone crafting after them will also have the chance to make top tier weapons. Expect this to be patched out eventually though. The next fix is something that was quite annoying to deal with. Governors would randomly teleport around the map instead of governing their fief. This fix was supposedly done in previous patches, so I'm cautiously optimistic here, but in my testing, I didn't see any governors traveling, so fingers crossed. I didn't test any of the quest fixes, but there are several pages of fixes and changes here, so if you ran into anything, it might be worth taking a look at. And finally, let's take a closer look at combat testing, since they made some changes to the AI. I ran many tests, including tournaments, bandit hideouts, and larger battles. The AI is extremely timid now, attacking at half the rate it previously did, and in some cases, even less. It used to be a challenge to defeat nobles in the tournaments, but now it's basically easy mode, even with a zero combat character against nobles with high combat skills. If you've struggled in the past with melee combat, now is the time to learn and get better, as the AI has never been worse before in my opinion. Even this bandit boss was a complete joke, stopping to block in 2 or 3 different directions between each attack, making it trivial to block their attacks. You would think the increased blocking would make them harder to hit, but it's basically the same as before, which means their offense is much worse, but their defense is about the same. Personally, combat was the biggest selling point for me in Bannerlord, and this change 100% took the fun out of it for me, and I'll be avoiding melee combat in the future campaigns, or playing with RBM once it's updated. I ran several large battles to see if these changes were optimized for big engagements at the expense of smaller ones, but sadly that doesn't seem to be the case. I wouldn't say larger battles are worse than before, but it certainly hasn't gotten better. It's mostly unchanged. Even when fighting heavily outnumbered, they throw up blocks in random directions more than attacking, which makes no sense at all. They already used ideas from other mods like adding rain or better workshop management, so why can't they use the AI from RBM? And while we're on the topic of terrible changes, let's talk about square and circle formation. I've not been able to use these for over 6 months since they broke them in a previous patch, and supposedly they were fixed in this patch. Sadly, that's not the case. Circle formation has only one option, a massively wide circle with very thin wall of troops. The only time I was able to get effective use from this formation was when it was tightly packed together, but that's no longer an option. Even when you click and drag the formation to make it tighter, the AI takes over and makes it wide and thin. It's still broken. Nobody should be using this crap. Surely square formation will even the score, right? Well, they do get into square formation and each side is facing outward, so that's a good start. Sadly, they are in a loose square with a ton of space between their neighbors, all but negating the benefits of this fantastic formation that I miss dearly. Here's a perfect example of why this formation is completely useless in its current implementation. Because our units are spaced out so widely, enemy cavalry can bully their way in and easily escape through the other side. Our troops inflict very few casualties, and it only gets worse when the enemy shield wall shows up. This clip perfectly sums up how I feel right now.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
2 more tests and we're done. I wanted to spend a bit more time testing the new targeting mechanic for different types of units, so I made an archer only and cavalry only party. I created 3 groups of archers and targeted each group of the enemy units to see if they would actually stick to the target that I gave them. This random cavalry came streaking through, and to my surprise, only the group targeting him was shooting, and the other 2 focused on the targets that I gave them. However, there was a section in the patch notes that said archers stop shooting when in range, even when given the charge or advance command, but I found this to be only half true. They continued to push forward and stopped when about 50 to 60% of their max range, so it seems they continue to push forward until uncomfortably close in some situations. I reran the test in a few more scenarios, including separating them wider to make sure they stuck to their targets. This group split their shots between the target and infantry that were closer and on their flank. This group continued to push forward even though the enemy was less than 50 meters away, wasting at least 1 or 2 volleys worth that they could have gotten off before entering melee combat and getting slaughtered. Overall, I think the targeting system is actually decent for archers. It's not perfect, but it's generally better than without using the targeting system. There was a line in the patch notes stating that they redid Cavalry AI, which is about the same as saying they fixed the kingdom policies. Some things are better, but a lot of things are actually still broken, and some even worse. When sending cavalry against other mounted units, the combat actually looks much cleaner. Units tend to stand and fight rather than ride around each other in tight circles and twerking all over the place. This is a very good change, as I generally avoided cav on cav violence before for this exact reason. Our banner knights made quick work of the enemy horse archers. However, this is where the good news ends. Cavalry against foot troops is not pretty. They still charge in without couch lancing often, use the wrong weapon, get stuck in enemy formations, and generally do very little damage. It was interesting to see the AI using the edge of the map defense that players love to use. I redid the test on an open map and charged from 3 different directions to see if that would help the results. Pay attention to this part of the screen. It's 10 to 15 seconds after the first charge from 3 directions on archers and shield troops, yet not a single kill was scored. I used 3 different types of tier 6 cavalry here too, but every one of them did a terrible job. Zooming into the fray, we can see some units coming in with polearms, some with one-handed weapons, some not even attacking anyone while passing dozens of foot troops. The enemy are taking casualties in their crossbowmen, but it's a very slow pace. In the end, it's a convincing loss with 133 kills on their side to our 86. The tier 6 cataphract did less than half of the other 2 elite units. I'm going to keep the final recap very short. Overall, the patch has a handful of great changes like unit targeting and kingdoms without land being destroyed. Tailworlds always does an amazing job with maps and bandit hideouts, and this patch was no exception. However, several of the changes were either poorly implemented or just flat out bad. Personal combat is dreadfully boring with AI blocking in random directions and an incredibly slow attack rate. Crashing was more frequent for me in over a dozen hours of testing. Cavalry have never been good, so it's no surprise that they are worse in most ways this patch. I say all of this knowing that this is a beta branch and some things will still change. However, aside from the crashing, I don't expect them to overhaul much else, as this would require them to redo a lot of the hard work that went into this patch. I'll be going back to a previous patch and continuing with modded campaigns for now. Click this video here to check out my Spartacus modded campaign using Eagle Rising and the European map mods. A special thank you to all the YouTube channel members and Patreon supporters who help support this channel financially. Thank you.